The year was 1887, and the winter had come to the reservation with teeth. It was a lean, vicious thing that gnawed at the canvas of the typist and stole the warmth from a man's bones before he could draw a full breath. For Chayton, who had seen only 18 such winters, this one felt like the oldest and cruelest of them all. The land, once a bountiful mother, was now a barren husk, picked clean of game. The government rations mealy flour and rancid lard were a slow poison, an insult that settled in the gut and soured the spirit. Sickness, a quiet companion to hunger, moved through the camp like a phantom, leaving a rattling cough in its wake. Chayton felt the weight of it all settle on his shoulders, a burden heavier than any pack. He was no longer a boy, but not yet a man in the way his grandfather had been a man, free to follow the herds across an open plain. His world was fenced in by lines on a map he could not see, and rules made by men he did not know. His days fell into a grim, repeating pattern. Rise before the sun painted the bruised sky, hunt for tracks where there were none, and return with hands that were empty and a heart that was hollow. He would see the hope fade from his mother's eyes and hear the shallow, ragged breathing of his little sister, Mesa, and the hollowness in his own chest would ache with a fierce, useless anger. He was trapped, caught between the fading stories of the elders and the stark, hungry reality of the now. He was a warrior with no war to fight, a hunter with no game to track, a provider with nothing to provide. He had built a shell around himself, a quiet, stoic thing that kept the world at bay. Inside that shell, however, a desperate fear churned, a fear for Mesa, whose small body was being consumed by the relentless cough. He would have traded his own spirit for a cure, sold his own future for a handful of nourishing food. It was a prayer he offered up to a silent sky each night, a desperate bargain whispered into the biting wind. He did not know that an answer of a kind was already on its way. The answer came in the form of Mr. Albright, the reservation agent. He was a man whose face seemed permanently pinched by disapproval, his compassion as thin as watered-down milk. He rode into their camp not with supplies, but with a proposition that was so strange, so deeply dishonorable, it stole the air from Chayton's lungs. He spoke of the widow, Eleanor Vance, the woman who owned the vast V-V ranch that bordered their starving lands. Her husband, a man of brutal reputation and immense wealth, had died in the fall, leaving her the sole heir to an empire of grass and cattle. Mr. Albright laid out the terms with the detached air of a man selling livestock. Eleanor Vance was 50 years old, childless, and beset by her late husband's relatives from the east, vultures circling what they believed was a dying carcass. To secure her claim under the laws of the white man, to hold the ranch against their greed, she needed a husband, a name on a piece of paper, a presence in the house. She had heard of Chayton's family, of their struggle, of his good name as a dutiful son, and so she had made an offer. "She will marry you," Albright said, his eyes avoiding Chayton's. "You will live at the ranch house. In return, she will provide for your family, a steer every week. Sacks of flour, sugar, coffee, medicine from the doctor in Blackwood for your sister, blankets, more than you could ever hope for." The words fell into the silence of the teepee like stones into still water. Chayton's mother gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. His father's face hardened into a mask of grim stone. Marry a white woman? A woman older than his own mother? It was not a marriage, it was a sale. He would be a kept thing, a pet to be paraded when needed, his dignity traded for beef and blankets. A hot shame washed over him, so potent it was like a physical blow. He wanted to spit, to scream, to tell Albright to take his disgusting offer and ride it straight to hell. But then he heard it, a small wet cough from the corner of the teepee where Mesa lay wrapped in thin trade blankets. It was a sound that cut through his pride, that silenced his rage. He looked at his sister's face, pale and glistening with fever in the dim light. He saw the gnawing desperation in his mother's gaze. What was his honor worth if his sister died? What was his pride worth if his family starved? The choice was no choice at all. It was a cage, and the door had just slammed shut. "I will do it," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. He did not look at his parents. He looked only at the dark corner where his sister fought for every breath. He was making a sacrifice, laying his own spirit down on an altar of necessity. He did not know, could not have imagined, that he was stepping into a world far more complex than simple shame, a world that held a loneliness as profound and a grief as deep as his own. The journey to the V-V ranch was a short one in miles, but it felt like crossing into another world. The land itself seemed to change, the sparse, overgrazed reservation giving way to rolling hills of thick, cured grass that swayed like a golden sea. The ranch house loomed on a rise, a two-story fortress of dark timber and river stone, its windows like vacant eyes staring out over the vast expanse of its domain. It was a house built on power, solid and unyielding, and it made Chayton feel small, a piece of driftwood washed up on an alien shore. He was met not by the woman, but by a stern, grey-haired housekeeper named Martha, whose lips were set in a permanent line of disapproval. She led him through the house in a silence that was thick and oppressive. The air inside was still and cold, smelling faintly of lemon oil and old sorrow. Dark, heavy furniture stood like silent sentinels on polished wood floors. Portraits of stern-faced ancestors stared down from the walls, their painted eyes following his every move. It was the quietest place he had ever been, a tomb sealed against the world. His rooms were in a separate wing, larger than his family's entire tipi. There was a soft bed with a thick quilt, a wardrobe of dark wood, and a window that looked out not toward the east and the rising sun, but west, over the endless empty hills. It felt like a gilded cage. Martha informed him that Mrs. Vance would expect him for dinner at 6. Her tone made it clear this was not an invitation, but a command. When the clock in the hall chimed the hour, he made his way to the dining room. It was a long, cavernous space, dominated by a table that could have seated 20. Eleanor Vance sat at one end, a solitary figure in a high-backed chair. She was dressed in a severe black gown, her silver-streaked hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull at the corners of her eyes. Her face was a mask of pale, composed neutrality. There were lines of grief and fatigue etched around her eyes and mouth, but her expression gave nothing away. She was not the crone he had imagined, but she was not a welcoming presence either. She was like the house itself, formidable, remote, and steeped in a profound, unbreachable loneliness. "Mr. Chayton," she said, her voice low and even, without a trace of warmth. "Please, sit." She indicated the chair at the opposite end of the vast table. The distance between them was a chasm, a physical representation of the gulf that separated their worlds. He sat, his back straight, his hands resting in his lap. He felt clumsy and out of place, the rough wool of his trousers a stark contrast to the fine linen of the tablecloth. The meal was served by Martha in suffocating silence. The clink of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. Chayton ate what was put before him, the rich food, tasting strange on his tongue. He kept his eyes down, but he could feel her gaze on him, not curious or cruel, but assessing. It was the way a rancher might study a new piece of breeding stock. The thought sent another wave of hot shame through him. After the plates were cleared, she finally spoke of the arrangement. Her words were direct, stripped of any pretense of sentiment. "This is a contract, Mr. Chayton, a business arrangement. You will want for nothing here. Your family will receive the promised provisions. Your presence is required. You will act as the master of this house. When we have visitors, or when we must go into Blackwood, you will be at my side. You will be my husband." She said the word husband as if it were a legal term, devoid of any human meaning. "In all other matters, your time is your own. My life is my own. Is that understood?" "I understand," he said, his voice quiet. "Good," she said, and for a moment he saw a flicker of something in her eyes, weariness, perhaps, or a deep and abiding sadness before the mask of composure slipped back into place. She rose from her chair. I am tired. Good night." She left him there, alone at the end of the long, empty table. The silence of the house rushed back in to fill the space she had vacated. He was a ghost in this house of ghosts, a stranger bound by a bargain that had saved his family but cost him his soul. He sat there for a long time, watching the candlelight flicker, a prisoner in a fortress of wealth and sorrow, wondering what kind of life this would be. He could not yet see the cracks in her armor, nor could he feel the tectonic plates of their two solitary worlds beginning to shift, slowly, imperceptibly, toward each other. The days that followed fell into a strange, silent rhythm. Chayton would wake with the sun, the habit of a lifetime he could not break, and find the house still asleep, wrapped in its shroud of quiet. He would walk the land, not the house. The house felt like a cage, but the land, this vast, sprawling territory of grass and sky, was something he could almost understand. He learned its contours, the way the wind moved through the cottonwoods by the creek, the high places where the hawks circled. It was her land, her property, but the wind and the sky belonged to no one. He rarely saw Eleanor before their silent, formal dinner. He knew she spent her days in her late husband's study, a room filled with ledgers and maps, wrestling with the immense and complex machinery of the ranch. He would sometimes catch a glimpse of her through the open door, a small, determined figure bent over a desk, her face etched with concentration. She was fighting a battle of her own, he realized, a war waged with numbers and ink. Their evenings at the long dining table remained a ritual of distance. The space between them felt charged with unspoken things. He was intensely aware of her, of the slight tremor in her hand as she lifted her water glass, of the way her eyes would sometimes drift to the window, her gaze lost in the falling dusk. He observed her as a hunter observes a wary animal, learning her habits, her silences, the subtle shifts in the atmosphere around her. He was still suspicious, still guarded, but a sliver of curiosity had begun to work its way under his skin. Who was this woman, really, beneath the black dress and the fortress of polite reserve? The first crack in the wall of silence came not from a person, but from a horse. Eleanor owned a magnificent black stallion, a creature of fire and midnight silk named Obsidian. He was her pride, the last gift from her husband. One morning, Chayton saw the ranch hands leading the horse into the corral, and he saw at once that the stallion was favoring his front leg, a deep limp that spoke of serious injury. The foreman, a gruff man named Shaw, declared it a torn ligament. The horse was ruined, he said, fit for nothing but a bullet. Chayton saw Eleanor standing by the corral fence, her face pale, her hands clenched at her sides. He saw in her eyes a flash of raw, unguarded pain. Without thinking, he moved to her side. "Let me look at him," he said, his voice low. Shaw scoffed. "What's a reservation boy know about $1,000 horse?" Chayton ignored him, his eyes on Eleanor. "My people have ways. With horses. Let me try." She studied his face for a long moment, her gaze searching. He met it without flinching. Something in his quiet confidence, or perhaps in her own desperation, made her decide. "Let him," she commanded, her voice sharp. Shaw grumbled, but stepped back. Chayton entered the corral. He did not approach the horse with ropes or force. He stood still, letting the animal feel his presence. He spoke to it in Lakota, soft, murmuring sounds that were more like a prayer than a command. Slowly, patiently, he ran his hands over the horse's powerful frame, his touch light and knowing. He found the heat, the swelling high on the shoulder, not the leg. It was a deep muscle bruise, not a torn ligament. Over the next few days, he worked on the stallion. He used hot poultices of herbs he gathered from the creek bed and a gentle rhythmic massage that his grandfather had taught him. The ranch hands watched with open skepticism, whispering among themselves. Eleanor watched from the porch of the house, saying nothing. A week later, Chayton led Obsidian from the corral. The limp was gone. The horse moved with its old grace and power, a living piece of the night sky. He stopped before the porch where Eleanor stood. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not say anything. He simply held the reins out to her. She walked down the steps and took them from his hand. Her fingers brushed his, a fleeting, electric touch. She ran a hand down the stallion's gleaming neck, her eyes shining with a moisture she did not try to hide. She looked at Chayton, and for the first time, the mask was gone. In its place was a look of raw, unvarnished gratitude, and something else, respect. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely a whisper. It was only 2 words, but they were the first real words that had ever passed between them. That evening, at dinner, she did not sit at the far end of the table. She instructed Martha to set a place for him beside her. The chasm between them had not vanished, but it had narrowed, just enough for a fragile bridge to begin to form. The bridge was built of small, quiet moments. One night, as a full moon bathed the prairie in silver, she asked him about the stars. He told her the story of the great bear and the 7 hunters who pursued it across the sky, his voice low in the stillness of the room. She listened, rapt, her gaze fixed on his face, and for a little while she was not the formidable Mrs. Vance, and he was not the boy she had bought. They were just 2 people sharing a story in the dark. Another time, he was carving a small wooden meadowlark, a gift to send back for Mesa with the weekly supply wagon. He was sitting on the porch steps, the wood shavings curling around his feet, when she came and sat on the railing above him. She didn't ask what he was doing. She simply watched, her silence no longer uncomfortable, but companionable. "I had a son," she said suddenly, her voice so soft he almost missed it. "His name was Walter. He would have been 25 this year." Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, on the place where the sky met the earth. "He loved birds. He knew all their songs. He died of a fever when he was 7. Chayton stopped carving. He did not know what to say. The grief in her voice was a raw, living thing, a wound that 30 years had not healed. He looked at the portrait in the hall in his mind's eye. The serious little boy in the velvet soutane understood. Her fortress was not built to keep the world out. It was built to hold her shattering grief in. He simply nodded, a small, silent acknowledgement of her pain. It was enough. In that shared, unspoken sorrow, another stone was laid on their bridge. Then the blizzard came. It descended without warning, a swirling white fury that erased the world. The sky and the earth became one, a churning vortex of snow and wind. For 3 days, the ranch was an island, cut off from everything. The wind howled like a grieving spirit, rattling the windows and piling drifts as high as the porch roof. They were trapped in the house together, just Chayton, Eleanor, and the silent Martha. The forced proximity dissolved the last of their formal distance. They worked together, ensuring the livestock in the nearby barn were secure, hauling firewood, melting snow for water when the pump froze. In the evenings, they sat by the great stone fireplace, the only truly warm place in the drafty house. It was during the storm that he began to see the woman beneath the widow's weeds. He saw her strength, her grit, her deep, abiding love for the land and the creatures on it. She spoke of her early years on the ranch, arriving as a young bride from Philadelphia, terrified and lonely. She spoke of how she had learned to ride, to understand the seasons, to love the harsh beauty of the plains. She did not speak of her late husband with love, but with a kind of weary resignation, hinting at a life that had been difficult and lonely long before his death. He, in turn, found himself speaking of his home, not of the hunger and the sickness, but of the way the light fell on the black hills at dawn, of the smell of sage after a rain, of the sound of the drum and the feel of the earth beneath his feet during a dance. He spoke of Mesa, of her cleverness and her laughter. In the warm, flickering light of the fire, insulated from the world by the raging storm, they were no longer a transaction. They were 2 people, stripped of their titles and their roles, sharing the fragile warmth of a fire and the deeper warmth of a newfound, unexpected connection. The snow that had imprisoned them had, in a strange way, set them free. When the storm finally broke and the sun shone on a world remade in glittering white, the silence that settled over the house was different. It was no longer the silence of absence and distance. It was the silence of peace, of a quiet, shared understanding. But peace, in that hard country, was a fragile and fleeting thing. The peace was shattered by the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach, a black speck crawling across the pristine snow. It brought with it a threat more insidious than any blizzard. Patrick Donovan, the nephew of Eleanor's late husband, had come from the east. He was a man whose ambition was written plainly on his face, in the avarice of his eyes and the cruel set of his mouth. He was dressed in a fine city suit that looked utterly out of place against the raw landscape, and he carried with him an air of smug superiority. He strode into the house as if he owned it, his gaze sweeping over the rustic furnishings with contempt. When his eyes landed on Chayton, who stood near the fireplace, they narrowed with a mixture of shock and disgust. "Aunt Eleanor," he said, his voice slick with false concern as he turned to her. "What is the meaning of this? The rumors in Blackwood are unsettling. I came at once." He gestured dismissively at Chayton. "They say you've taken up with a savage." "This is Chayton Vance," Eleanor said, her voice cold as ice, her posture ramrod straight. "My husband." Patrick let out a short, ugly laugh. "Husband? Aunt, you must be mad with grief. This is an outrage. A boy, an Indian. This marriage is a farce, a sham, and it will not stand. I am here to protect the family's interests and your reputation." His true meaning was clear. He was there to protect his own inheritance. He saw Chayton not as a person, but as a legal obstacle, an insult to his family's name, and a weakness in Eleanor's position that he could exploit. The fragile peace of the ranch was gone, replaced by a tense, ugly current of hostility. The days that followed were a quiet war. Patrick installed himself in one of the guest rooms, a toxic presence polluting the air of the house. He made no secret of his intentions. He spent his time riding to Blackwood, spreading poison in the saloons and the general store. He painted a picture of a grieving, addled widow bewitched by a cunning native, a story that found fertile ground in the town's deep-seated prejudice. He spoke loudly at the dinner table of legal petitions and competency hearings, his words aimed like arrows at Eleanor. His presence forced Eleanor and Chayton into an unwilling, unspoken alliance. They had to be seen together. They had to present a united front against his campaign of whispers and threats. When Patrick was watching, Chayton would stand a little closer to her, a silent, protective presence. She, in turn, would address him with a familiarity she had never used before, asking his opinion on ranch matters in front of her nephew, a clear and deliberate display of respect for his position. The performance became, by degrees, less of a performance. The shared threat forged their tentative connection into something stronger, something tempered by adversity. They were no longer just two lonely people who had found a sliver of understanding. They were partners in a battle for her home, for her autonomy. Patrick's cruelty had the opposite effect of what he intended. Instead of driving a wedge between them, it cemented them together. He tried to undermine Chayton with the ranch hands, referring to him as the squaw man or the widow's pet. But the hands had seen Chayton heal obsidian. They had seen his quiet competence, his deep knowledge of the land. They might not have understood the arrangement, but they respected skill, and they despised Patrick's city-bred arrogance. His insults mostly earned him sullen glares. The conflict escalated one afternoon in the stables. Patrick, emboldened by whiskey, began berating one of the younger ranch hands over a trivial matter. When Chayton calmly intervened, telling him to leave the boy alone, Patrick's rage finally boiled over. "You dare to give me orders?" he sneered, his face mottled with fury. "You, who are nothing but a piece of property she bought to spite us. You are not the master here. You are a dirty, red-skinned fraud." Chayton stood his ground, his face a calm, unreadable mask, but his fists were clenched at his sides. He felt the old, hot anger rise in him, the same anger he had felt in the face of his people's slow starvation. But he also felt Eleanor's presence in his mind, the memory of her quiet strength. He would not give this man the satisfaction of a brawl. he would not descend to his level. "This is not your land, Donovan," Chayton said, his voice low and steady. "And I am not your problem. You are your own problem." Before Patrick could respond, Eleanor appeared in the stable doorway. She had heard the raised voices, her eyes, cold and flinty, fixed on her nephew. "Patrick," she said, and her voice cut through the tension like a whip. "You will not speak to my husband that way. You are a guest in this house, a guest whose welcome is wearing thin. Go to town, sober up, and think very carefully about your next words." Defeated, humiliated in front of the men, Patrick stormed out, muttering threats. In the sudden quiet of the stable, Eleanor and Chayton looked at each other. He saw in her eyes a fierce, protective fire he had never seen before. She had defended him. She had called him her husband, and for the first time, the word had not sounded like a legal term. It had sounded like a shield. He knew then that Patrick would not give up. This was just the beginning. The real storm was yet to come. The storm broke a week later. It arrived not as wind and snow, but as a black carriage pulling up the drive, kicking up dust in the late morning sun. Patrick Donovan stepped out, but he was not alone. With him were two other men, the town sheriff, a man named Hale, whose authority was easily swayed by wealth and influence, and a sharp-faced lawyer from Blackwood, clutching a leather satchel. This was it, the formal assault. Eleanor met them at the door, Chayton standing just behind her, a silent shadow at her shoulder. She did not invite them in, but they pushed past her into the great hall, their presence an immediate violation of the home's quiet dignity. "Eleanor, this is an intervention," Patrick began, his tone dripping with a loathsome, feigned pity. "For your own good. I have here," he nodded to the lawyer, who opened his satchel, "a petition signed by dozens of concerned citizens of Blackwood, and a legal motion to have you declared mentally incompetent to manage your own affairs." Sheriff Hale shuffled his feet, looking uncomfortable. "Ma'am, it's irregular. This marriage." He gestured vaguely toward Chayton. "People are talking. Patrick here has a legitimate family interest. My interest is in seeing this ranch me uncle's legacy preserved, not squandered or made a mockery of." Patrick's voice rose, filling the hall. He turned his full, venomous attention to Chayton. "And you think you can waltz in here and take what belongs to decent, hard-working white folk? You think we'll let this charade stand? You are nothing." A savage she picked up from the gutter out of some pathetic, grief-stricken madness. Eleanor grew pale, her hand gripping the back of a chair for support. The public cruelty of it, the sheer force of their greed, seemed to stun her into silence. For a terrifying moment, Chayton thought she would break. He could see the lawyer preparing the papers for her to sign, could see the smug victory in Patrick's eyes. It was in that moment that something inside Chayton shifted. He was not a boy any longer. He was not a victim of circumstance. He was the man of this house. He was her husband. He took a single step forward, placing himself slightly in front of Eleanor. He did not look at Patrick or the lawyer. He looked at Sheriff Hale, the man who was meant to represent the law, not the mob. He did not raise his voice. He spoke with a quiet, profound stillness that commanded the room more effectively than any shout. "Sheriff," he said, "you speak of what is regular. Is it regular for a man to threaten a woman in her own home? Is it regular for greed to wear the mask of concern?" Then he turned his head and looked at Eleanor. He did not see a frail, incompetent woman. He saw the woman who had fought for this ranch, who had survived a difficult husband and buried a beloved child, who had healed a broken horse with her hope and bridged the gulf between their worlds with quiet courage. "This woman," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, unwavering respect, "is stronger than any of you. This land knows her. She has put 30 years of her life into its soil. Her grief is not a madness. It is a testament to a heart that has known great love and great loss. This is her home, and I am her husband. A promise was made. In my culture, a promise is a sacred thing. It has more weight than any paper you carry in that bag." His words hung in the air, simple, direct, and laden with an unshakable truth. They were a shield, not of law, but of honor. He had not defended his own position, he had defended hers. He had not claimed any rights, he had affirmed her strength. Something in his quiet dignity, in the absolute sincerity of his voice, reached Eleanor. The paleness left her face, replaced by a flush of color. The tremor in her hand stilled. She drew herself up to her full height, and the formidable mistress of the V-V returned, her eyes blazing with a cold fire. She stepped forward, taking her place beside Chayton. She looked directly at Patrick, and the full force of her scorn and authority hit him like a physical blow. "Get out of my house," she said, her voice low and dangerously calm. "You speak of my husband's legacy. My husband built this ranch with his hands, yes, but I made it a home. I held it together while he raged. I buried my son on this land. This is my legacy, not his, and it is certainly not yours. You are a parasite, Patrick, a grasping, hateful little man. And you," she turned to Sheriff Hale, "should be ashamed. You have allowed yourself to be the tool of a bully. Now take him, and this ridiculous petition, and get off my property. If you ever set foot on V-V land again without my express invitation, I will have you charged with trespassing. Do you understand me?" Her power was absolute. It was the authority of a queen in her own castle. The lawyer began to stammer, stuffing his papers back into his satchel. Sheriff Hale, his face burning with shame, mumbled an apology and practically pushed a sputtering, enraged Patrick Donovan toward the door. They left. The heavy oak door closed behind them, shutting out the world. The sudden silence in the hall was vast and profound. The threat was gone. The battle was won. In the quiet aftermath, Chayton and Eleanor stood side by side, not moving. The adrenaline of the confrontation slowly ebbed away, leaving behind something raw and new. He turned to look at her, and she looked at him. The last of the walls between them, the last pretense of their arrangement, crumbled into dust. In her eyes, he saw not just gratitude, but a deep, resonant admiration. And in his, she saw not a boy or a bargain, but a man of honor who had stood for her when no one else would. Without a word, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm. The touch was not fleeting this time. It was a firm, solid connection, an anchor. They had faced the storm together and held. The weeks that followed the confrontation settled into a new kind of equilibrium, a quiet rhythm built not on contract but on connection. The great, echoing house no longer felt like a tomb, it felt like a sanctuary. The long dining table was abandoned in favor of smaller, more intimate meals taken in the kitchen or by the warmth of the fireplace in the main hall. The silence that fell between them was no longer awkward or heavy with unspoken questions. It was a comfortable, easy silence, the kind shared by two people who have no need for words to understand one another. The pretense of their arrangement had evaporated, and in its place, something genuine and resilient had begun to grow. It was not the fiery passion of youth, but something quieter, deeper, and perhaps more enduring. It was a bond forged in shared solitude, tested by adversity, and solidified by mutual respect. It was a strange and unexpected love, born from the most unlikely of soils. Chayton's role on the ranch transformed. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of the property. He worked alongside the men, his innate understanding of the land, and the animals earning him their unquestioning respect. He taught them his methods for tracking lost cattle, for reading the weather in the clouds, for knowing which grasses would provide the best forage. Eleanor, in turn, began to teach him the other side of the ranch, the ledgers, the accounts, the business of buying and selling. She would sit with him in the study in the evenings, explaining the complex dance of numbers, her voice patient, her hand sometimes brushing his as she pointed to a column or a map. They were partners, in every sense of the word. The provisions for his family continued, but they were different now. Chayton managed the deliveries himself, ensuring the food and medicine were distributed not as charity from a distant widow, but as support from a son and a brother. He rode back to the reservation regularly, and the sight of him, healthy and strong on a fine horse, brought a quiet pride to his father's eyes and a relieved joy to his mother's. Mesa's cough was gone, replaced by the bright, happy chatter of a healthy child. She would run to greet him, throwing her arms around his legs, the small wooden meadowlark he had carved for her clutched in her hand. One crisp autumn day, he asked Eleanor to ride with him. She hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. As they rode into the modest camp, a respectful quiet fell. His people saw not the rich white woman, the rumored buyer of one of their own. They saw the woman who stood with Chayton, whose name was now linked with his. His mother came forward and offered Eleanor a cup of warm tea, a simple gesture of acceptance that spoke volumes. Eleanor accepted it with a quiet grace, her eyes meeting the older woman's in a moment of shared, maternal understanding. They did not speak the same language, but in that moment they understood each other perfectly. Months turned into a year. The cycle of seasons turned, bringing with it a sense of healing and renewal. The harsh memory of the first winter faded, replaced by the quiet contentment of their shared life. They had built a home together, an unconventional fortress of two against a world that did not understand them. They had found in each other a solace for their individual griefs, a balm for their loneliness. One evening they stood on the porch, a familiar ritual, watching the sky bruise into nightfall over the rolling hills. The air was cool and smelled of pine and distant rain. For a long time they stood in comfortable silence, simply sharing the view. "I never thought," Eleanor said, her voice soft in the twilight, "that I would feel peace in this house again. For so long, it was just a place of memory and obligation." She turned to him, and in the dim light, he could see the lines of sorrow on her face had softened, smoothed by a quiet happiness. "You brought life back into it, Chayton. You brought life back into me." He looked at her, at this strong, resilient woman who had offered a desperate bargain and had, in turn, given him a future he could never have imagined. He had come to her as a sacrifice, a boy selling his freedom to feed his family. He had stayed as a partner, a protector, a husband. He had lost one home only to find another, in the most unexpected of places. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. Her hand felt small and warm in his. "We saved each other, Eleanor," he said, and it was the simple, unvarnished truth. They stood there together as the first stars pricked the deep velvet of the sky, two people from two different worlds, bound by an unlikely love, their silhouettes merging into one against the vast, silent canvas of the American West. They had faced judgment and hatred, and had answered it not with anger, but with dignity and a quiet, unshakable loyalty. In a world determined to tear them apart, they had simply and bravely held on.